May we then move on, please, to the next item of business, which is the board paper on developing commissioning support and the future for commissioning support units. I'm going to invite Ros Rawson to introduce the paper. Please, Ros.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'd just like to begin with a bit of context about CSUs and the current environment in which they're operating. So firstly, commissioning support units provide a range of services to commissioners of healthcare, things like the negotiation of contracts on behalf of commissioners, IT services, human resources, finance, and support for major transformation. They don't provide frontline patient care, but they do provide some of the critical functions which, executed well, can help our commissioners secure great health services today and support for the delivery of the changes that we want to see in the future. I know myself from visiting CSUs around the country, the difference that great support can make and the great strides that are being made in improving these services. So it's really important for us to make sure that there are excellent and affordable commissioning support services available. I think secondly, I'd just like to explain the background to the CSUs. They're not statutory bodies. They were created during the government's reforms with two reasons in mind. I think first, by operating at scale, they've enabled these services to be delivered far more efficiently, and that's supported the system in the cuts we've made in the amount devoted to administration and management costs in the health service, so that more of the health budget can be devoted to patient care. And secondly, the vision for the creation of clinical commissioning groups was designed to put clinical leaders at the heart of commissioning healthcare, concentrating on their relationships with patients and their communities. So our ambition is to enable CCGs to remain clinically focused, lean, agile organisations focused on their core purpose of improving the quality for their population. And commissioning support services have enabled this to happen. And then thirdly, as part of the context, just to give you a sense of the current position, I think the paper sets out the journey that led to the hosting of CSUs by NHS England as part of securing safe transition during the reforms. But this isn't a stable position. CCGs are free now to choose where they secure their commissioning support from. So many of them choose to buy it from CSUs, but some already get it from other sectors, and a handful have chosen to keep some of these services in-house. So what we know is that the current arrangements are not giving CSUs the best chances of survival in this increasingly competitive environment. And without greater freedoms to manage risks or enter into alliances, change rapidly to respond to demands, we don't think we're going to be able to secure our goal of creating excellent, affordable support services for the future. So that's some of the context. What I'm asking the board today is to consider two things. I think the first is the potential options for future organisational form for these units, and secondly, the process. So we've had extensive conversations and engagement to develop a number of options, and we've talked to staff-side organisations, CSUs themselves, CCGs, the voluntary sector, patient representative groups. And what we've been trying to do is assess these options against what is likely to give the greatest chance of creating excellent and affordable services for the future, but mindful of protecting the interests of the taxpayer of these publicly funded services. So that's the balance that we've been looking at in assessing these options. The CSU committees considered this in some detail, and what our proposition is that the preferred options for future autonomy, so the things we think that will give CSUs the freedoms they need to operate in this environment, are social enterprise, the staff mutual, a customer-controlled entity or a joint venture. And in all four options, the terms and conditions of existing staff transferring to the new organisations would be protected, including membership of the NHS pension scheme. I think it's an important point. So I can return to those options in more detail if the board wishes. What we're also proposing is ruling out a number of options. So the paper kind of outlines why, and I'd just like to cover particularly two of these. I think the first of these is around an outright sale. And I think our view's been this is still a developing market, and there could be a bit of a risk in this option that the NHS would be giving away value to the private sector buyer, and we do need to ensure that we are protecting the interests of taxpayers. We think that's put at greater risk by this option, and that's why we want to rule this option out. I think the second important question I think that people have been asking is, could things just stay as they are, continued hosting? And I think, as I said, the CSUs are already operating in a competitive market. So these units are increasingly having to compete with bodies not subject to some of the controls which are rightly appropriate to public sector bodies. So we think that without giving them greater freedom to operate, their chances of survival are weaker, and that then also both increases the cost to the taxpayer, the implications for staff, but more important, increases the likelihood that we won't be able to secure excellent affordable commissioning support. So we're proposing to rule out this option also. So moving on to the process, the CSU committee members, we considered whether there should be a national consultation. And this is the preference of the national staff side organisations. And I think we should put on record they've raised with us their strong view that there should be an opportunity for a national debate on these options through a consultation. Ultimately, it will be for individual CSUs to consult with staff and stakeholders to decide on what specific form what's the form by which they would become autonomous, subject to a robust assurance process that NHS England would run. And so we've took the view that rather than have 2 rounds of consultation, it would make more sense for consultation to happen once locally on specific proposals that staff and customers can engage with. I think this will reduce kind of duplication and confusion and allow for a meaningful discussion about real options. This local consultation, though, needs to happen within a national framework. So what we're recommending to the board, that the CSU committee are asked to oversee the development of that framework for local consultation on the range of forms available and any necessary safeguards that we need to put in place. And I would want to emphasise, in developing that framework, we want to commit to continued engagement with the trade unions, make sure that to ensure we get consistent treatment on employment issues, test with them the timetable for transition, assurance processes and any necessary safeguards. So at the end of the paper, we've set out the kind of next steps in the process and asking the board to approve the development of the national framework comprising 4 alternative organisational forms and to approve a locally led approach to development with assurance by NHS England.
Ros, thank you very much for that introduction. If I may, what I'd propose to the board is that we take the discussion in 2 segments. The first one being about the 4 options that are being proposed to form the national framework, and within that discussion some consideration of the 5 that are not being proposed, because I would wish the board at the end of this to be clear that these are the right 4, or if they're not the right 4, then what are the right 4. And then secondly, the process issue about consultation, because I think the 2 naturally interlock. But if we can be absolutely clear about the national framework, I think it helps us then to be able to take a wise decision about the consultation process. So perhaps to initiate that first part of the discussion, I might invite Moira and Ed as non-executive representatives on the CSU committee, whether they have any observations that they'd like to offer us to follow up what Ros has already said. Moira.
I think Ros has set it out very well, Malcolm, thank you. But it strikes me that people will probably be dissatisfied on both sides of this discussion, really. And I think I would want to emphasise that what we're trying to do is to balance both the giving CSUs the freedom to actually gain enough business to be functioning organisations that support our principle of delivering excellent commissioning, but also protecting the public interest of where we are now. And I think these 4 options provide that appropriate balance. I think it's also worth, given that I've got the floor, saying how much incredible hard work has gone into the CSUs, both by the staff of the CSU, but also from people in NHS England, to try to ensure that CCGs and NHS England have access to this, to the highest quality of support. But this isn't going to be a once and for all change. This is a development. We're going to, you know, change will be inevitable in this landscape over the future. What we're trying to do is to give them the best possible start while being mindful of that public interest.
I think that we have seen the CSUs over the course of the last year or so really improve, enhance what they do, and in fact they've been reforming to a degree because there's been some merger and some integration. So we are in a place where the market is quite dynamic, where they recognise the improvements and the CCGs recognise the improvements that are being made, but they are constrained at the moment by some of the controls over what they can do and what they can't do. So I do think this process of moving them to another form, which started in a way some time ago, is absolutely appropriate, and we have to look at the safeguards on public value, but also recognise that a market is fast developing beyond the 19 CSUs that we have for the services which the CCGs now are able to procure. So I think we have a real obligation to make the CSUs, help the CSUs move into that market in the best way possible. Otherwise they will potentially wither on the vine, Malcolm, which I think would be deeply unsatisfactory for the health service.
So what we've got to be clear about, I think, is how we tread that line between, on the one hand, providing the autonomy that highly skilled organisations need in order to compete in a competitive market, and on the other hand, protecting the public interest in terms both of value and values for the future of the service. Would it help if what we might do to approach this, I think, is to look at the 5 options that we're not proposing to go ahead with? And if I look at those, it seems to me that I've just heard pretty good arguments about option C, which is continuing the present hosting arrangements. I think the added argument on this front is that it is blighting. It was originally proposed that CSUs should be made autonomous, David tells me, from April 2012 originally, or certainly then from the next year, April 2013, when we were launched and the rest of the reforms took place. But because that was thought to be precipitate, we needed further consideration, we needed time for consolidation, we're now working to a slower timetable. But the longer that timetable stretches out, the greater the uncertainty, the greater the inability to plan for the future, and therefore the greater the blighting effect. So can I just be clear with the board that option C is not an option that is being proposed, and that you're content to rule that out? If we may then go to option A, which is the outright sale of CSUs. The argument in the paper, I think the principal argument, is about the significant risk of loss of value to the taxpayer were that option to be proposed. Are there any comments colleagues would wish to venture about option A? But can I just check, we are content, are we, that option A should not be part of the national framework? Thank you. Option B, which is the central outsourcing as a single entity, I think is quite contrary to the direction of travel that we've been in discussion with the CSUs about, and would not be a wise movement given the current structure of the CSUs. Are we content to rule that out? Yep. Okay. Option D and E, I think, are very similar. Option D is the creation of new NHS bodies, and option E, the adoption by an existing NHS body. Let me just hear further about those. I mean, I think that on option D, the argument is in the paper that it would be contrary to wider government policy on reducing the number of public bodies. And I think the critical argument, which goes back to the way in which Ros expressed it at the outset, would this actually give the autonomy and the freedom of movement that would actually not only create the highly skilled commissioning support services that the CCGs want, but also allow them to compete against other providers of those services. And your conclusion and your recommendation to us is that it would not be the case.
Yes, it is. I think the issues that pertain now to the hosting of CSUs, that those constraints apply equally in these two options. And so I think the point about it's the environment in which CSUs are operating, this competitive environment, how can we enable them to survive in that environment? Neither of these options would give them the freedoms that they would need to do that.
Okay. Can I then just be clear with the board that those 5 options are not options that anybody on the board would wish to see as part of the national framework? Right. Okay. I think then it behoves us to come back to options A, B, C and D, which are part of that proposed framework, and to understand again from you, Ros, that these have not been plucked from thin air, but are the consequence of extensive discussions already with CSUs, with CCGs and with other stakeholders.
Yes, they are. Yes, so this is since we published last June the strategy for commissioning support. We've had extensive conversations with all kind of interested parties about what the options might be for the future form, and this doesn't come from a blank sheet of paper, because of course we've had the Transforming Community Services programme in the NHS, where so we see social enterprises as part of the NHS providers of NHS funded care. So these are models that we're already in existence in the health and care system.
Well, let me just then take comments from around the board table on these 4 models. Ros has introduced them with great clarity, but what we're trying to do again is to balance the value and the values of the NHS, the value to taxpayer and the autonomy that we wish to see conferred upon the organisations. Ros, are you content, and is the committee content, that each of these models has the potential to satisfy those criteria, and actually particularly has the potential to confer the degree of autonomy, the access to capital that these organisations are going to need if they're to compete with their existing competitors in the private market?
So I think all 4 options provide slightly different, strengths, and so I think that's why it's quite important that as we develop the national framework, if as proposed in the paper, that we lay out what those potential strengths might be, because you get slightly different things for the different options, and that will be an important part of the local consultation then, in light of the environment in which those CSUs are now operating, to identify what do they see as being the best way of creating excellent services for the future in that environment. All of that would then be subject to quite a robust process by NHS England, which we would lay out in this framework to ensure, as you say, that we're balancing the need to safeguard the interests of the taxpayer and create a sustainable long-term position for these services.
I think we'll come back and ask you some further questions about the next stages in the framework when we turn to the issue about consultation. But can I just, at this stage, invite comments from a member of the board on these 4 options? Kieran?
If you go back to the time that in social housing, where the housing stock in many places was transferred into effectively social enterprises and out of local authorities, one of the things that happened was that a lot of the value kind of went to the chief exec of the organisation or whatever, and suddenly there was lots of inflation at senior levels. What's the protection for ensuring that the way social enterprise or whichever structure behaves will actually be kind of commonsensical? Because I was trying to think it through. One of the things in social housing, of course, was the stock is where it is. You can't move. There's no such thing as, let's call it competition. But what's the mechanism for making sure that there isn't a sort of extreme behaviour in some places, shall we say?
So if you take kind of social enterprise as an option, what the kind of proposed, I think one of the legal forms it would be a community interest company limited by guarantee, or potentially a company limited by shares with a legal agreement. And what we would want to do in this process is look at what are the safeguards that we would put in place to make sure that we've learnt the lessons from any, as you say, any previous. There's been a whole range of things, and I don't know enough about what you've described to know if it's similar. But to make sure that we've safeguarded the interests of the taxpayer, as well as create an environment where it's in a position that as an organisation it can compete in this market.
Victor?
I think the comparison with RSLs and private finance is interesting. I mean, I was there, so I know a bit about it. The difference is that there was a ready market for capital because the RSLs had an asset base. So, in a sense, that was, some might argue, that was the generator of some of the behaviour that you mentioned. Here, these options are appropriate in that they fit with the principles that we've discussed earlier. I don't think we should pretend that it's going to be easy to access capital. I mean, I run a social enterprise, and I know that one of the challenges is explaining to the market what the model is in the first place, and then secondly, the market understanding how they get their money out. So I think there are challenges in each of these. In specifically the final option, which is the joint venture, in a sense is clearer for the raising of capital, but raises other issues. The community interest company form does provide a limited guarantee for taxpayers' money against excess, but it's not without its challenges. So I think these are the right options, but we shouldn't be pretending that they're perfect and without challenge, and they're all challenged, I think, by the capital issue and the uncertainty of the market. You know, anybody investing will have to have some pretty positive signals about the market going forward.
Barbara?
Ross, I understand that quite a number of the CSUs have already got a partnership with an independent sector provider already, largely because I think in essence what has happened is that the massive resource of individuals with expertise on commissioning NHS services sits within the NHS, whereas often the private sector either has tools or ways of doing things, and the two married together really is where you get the real economies of scale and the best value. Presumably none of the models that are being suggested, the first three in particular, would preclude that, and therefore presumably that sort of partnership arrangement is something that we are quite likely to see continuing in those models without necessarily the joint venture, again, which I understand there's not a huge appetite for at the moment, but presumably largely because these partnership models are working.
I think the options that we're proposing make that easier.
Right.
I think that is, so you're right, that is the kind of developments that are, some of the developments that are happening, but it would make it much easier and make it mean that CSUs could be more fleet of foot in responding to the demands of their customers, in finding kind of the right people to work with on particular issues.
Margaret?
In my mind, these definitely are the four right models, and going back to the question of whether in fact we're going to give sufficient certainty to enable investment, I think a lot of that's going to come out of the CCGs having confidence in the model that their local enterprise best supports and optimises, and I think that's going to mean that they're less likely to take things to themselves and try to in-house the operation, so leaving them to focus on what's core and what they should be doing. So it absolutely is the right thing to enable CSUs to survive for the future. I just think that we need to make sure that in allowing any of these and each of these four options to work well, the key is going to be to create a sort of under framework that establishes that we're not about to sell the family silver, if I can put it that way, so that recognising that there is a need to allow for investment, but also at the same time recognising that the model should preclude what is in effect sale by the back door. So in other words, we've made our decision about option 1, and sale is not on the table, and we need just to make sure that the way in which the enterprises are structured is very clear.
That has to be absolutely right, doesn't it? And indeed, it's not just the CCGs who need to be satisfied that this is providing best quality services, but ourselves in our capacity as direct commissioners, local government, third sector and other organisations that are making use of these services. So it's vitally important across a quite wide community that we get this absolutely right. Ed?
Yeah, I agree, Malcolm. I think the opportunity for these CSUs to develop is tremendous. I think all the forms are right, and building on what Barbara said, it's not just physical capital or financial capital. It's how we create the ability to build capability in these organisations, and all of these forms allow the injection of additional capability, either through partnership, either through supply agreements or through joint ventures. And I think the other point I'd make about the joint ventures is, they are not constrained just to external parties. There are many joint ventures which have employee shareholdings within that venture, and so there's, and I won't get this right, but there's a sort of mutual JV model within that fourth option, which we certainly shouldn't dismiss, and is potentially attractive as well.
So are we happy that these 4 options give the CSUs sufficient flexibility to in the process that follows to work out a model that will work best for them? Are we happy that we've covered the options that will give the variety of choice, the spread of opportunity?
I think they do, Malcolm, if I can just say, but they do something else which I think is vitally important, is they also protect the public value interest, which is a really important thing that the board has to take into account. So it's not just what the CSUs might want, it's our own obligations. And so that does define, in a way, those 4.
Right, I get the impression that we are content that these 4, I should say more than we're content. I mean, I think there's been a pretty rigorous discussion, and it follows a lot of consultation that's taken place already, that these 4, were they to go out as a national framework, would provide an appropriate balance between giving the CSUs the autonomy that we wish them to have, and which, frankly, they clearly need to have, and at the same time protecting public value and public values in the operation. So that then brings me to question 2 on the examination paper today, which is national framework or further consultation. We've had, I think, from Ros a recommendation that we should proceed now to adopting these as a national framework. And the arguments for that, I think, are, first of all, they have come from a process of extensive discussion and consultation. 2, they allow a crystallization, which then empowers discussions to commence with the staff of CSU, rather than for further discussions to continue about ranges of alternative models. And 3, allow us to develop the national framework, which, with further consultation with CSU and other stakeholders, which will help to define the crystallization of each of these models in greater detail. So can I ask the board whether you are content that we should adopt these as a national framework? Of course, there will still be much further consultation as we go forward on the detail of each of these models, but this should be a national framework that we now formally adopt as a board. We're content to do that? Right, thank you very much. May we then turn to the third area, Ros, which I think is what are the next steps that we will need to take, and the next steps that we would anticipate the CSUs are taking.
So I think that is sort of set out in the paper, that the next steps is we would then continue to work with stakeholders to produce this guidance overseen by the CSU committee. That we individual CSUs would then will have the opportunity to consider with their staff, with customers, key stakeholders, what's most likely to best suit the local needs. And we would look to have more of a phased approach to implementation, so individual CSUs applying when they're ready. That I think our ambition is that we would expect CSUs to become autonomous during 2016. That's just to give people a sense of the timeline. And we would have a robust assurance process precisely to deal with some of the issues that people have raised around safeguards. Alongside that, as you know, in our CSS strategy last summer, so one of the things that we need to do is to try and make sure we reduce all the transaction costs associated with this. And so we have embarked on developing a framework, a procurement framework in consultation with CCGs and others. And it will be being able to compete for business in that framework will allow us to have CSUs to develop a strong sense of their future viability before they reach the point of autonomy, which is an important bit of this process. So that's the kind of next steps.
So the take-home message of that is that there is not a single national model, there's not a single national process, there's not a single national timetable. We would expect each CSU to follow its own timetable, but with an anticipation that crystallisation will occur by the end of 2016.
It will happen within a national framework. So I
Yes.
think it's just important that when we publish the detail of the national framework and the assurance process, that is a national. That will be within a national process.
But then within that, each CSU has its choices.
Yeah.
And it has its choice of timetable as well within that national framework. In other words, this isn't a single national model being established to a single national timetable. Chief Executive.
Can I just say just a couple of things really, and about going back to kind of the principles around all this, because I mean, what we've described there, the process and the steps we've taken are really important, and I completely support them. But there are just two things that I'm sure we all understand, but I think they're really significant, for me, very significant about this organisation and what it is and all the rest of it. The first one is around clinical commissioning. We think clinical commissioning is a really powerful lever for improving quality of services for patients, and we believe those clinical commissioners should have autonomy. And this is part of that. You know, the whole thing about, I mean, the NHS generally has been reluctant, in a sense, to share services generally. And clinical commissioners have been at the forefront of doing that over the period. So to make sure that clinical commissioning groups really do remain to be lean and clinically focused is a really important part of that. And also then to give them the decision making around where they get their support are really important principles, and this kind of backs that and supports that, you know, in a really practical way. The idea of someone else telling clinical commissioners how best to do this, I think, is completely countercultural to what we're trying to do here. So I think that's the first thing for me. And the second thing for me, and I, as someone who's been in the public service for in fact, all of my career, this, I think, what we're doing here is we're backing a group of public service leaders to really transform service and to use all those tools that are available outside of the public service to enable us to get real excellence and top quality for commissioning support. And I think that's great. And the other thing that it does, it also gives the staff, and there are some there are lots and lots of fantastic staff working clinical support units who've worked for the NHS for many years, but it gives them, these options give them the opportunity to play a real role in building a new organisation, and I think those two principles are really important for us as we go forward and are completely consistent with the values and principles that we hold.
Right, well I think that's a very good way of framing the national framework that's going to come from here. It is about releasing energy, and actually it's about sustaining these services, which I think otherwise are under serious risk of decline. Well, then let me conclude. Are the board content to endorse the four principles? I think so, the four models. We're content to endorse that this is a national framework. We're content then to endorse the next steps that Ros has outlined to us. And Ros, we wish you well. I think just to pick up on David's final comments, this is an immensely positive array of options, and I think when we first looked at the future of CSUs, we were concerned to try to find a way through that would truly confer on them the autonomy that they need and allow them to function to the highest level. So I think David's words about public sector leadership are immensely important in that context. So thank you again, and members of the CSU committee, to whom we now assign the even more challenging task of making it work. Good. Thank you very much.